uh, in good academic style, prepared an hour and a half address on this subject, and obviously will not read it. Instead, I'd like to talk about it and hit a few of the main themes in the hopes that they may spark some interest in you and deal with what has become a very difficult subject. The subject is not difficult to understand. The subject is, how do you educate people for peace? Everybody thinks it's a great idea. Everybody would like to see more of it. We would like to build the New Jerusalem. We would like to usher in the Golden Age, which has been the eternal dream of mankind from the beginning of recorded history. How do we make the kingdom of God work? This is almost a genetic craving that we have, to have this peaceful world, to have this golden age, or as the Baha'is would say, the most great peace. We know it's coming. But when you look around the world today, you see many things that make you very skeptical and sometimes pessimistic. How do we change from what you might call a conflict-oriented, war-oriented basis to one which would ensure and enshrine peace in the hearts of men and women and throughout the world? And that's where the going gets tough. We know that we would like to see it coming, but it isn't going to come by wishing. It's going to come by hard, dedicated work. And even that doesn't sound very attractive. Who wants to be invited to a lecture and told that there's going to be lots of hard work ahead of time and it's going to hurt and so on? I'd like to suggest, however, that there's something else that we have forgotten. That there's something magical and mystical and mysterious and transcends time and space. That's religion. We haven't tried religion in this context too successfully. And I think that's what we have to emphasize if we are to build the basis of a solid world peace. So I'd like to give you some of the ideas that I've been trying to put together in my own mind. And I've had the benefit of going to conferences on peace education, and learning a lot from the people who have been there, and trying to add some of my own reading to that whole question. So I'll get as much out as I can that I've tried to put together, and I'd appreciate it if our chairman would give me a signal when I've got about 10 minutes and about 5 minutes. And then I'll keep close to the time. A book was published in 1980, I think it was, called No Limits to Learning. Anybody familiar with that? The publication of the Club of Rome. Are you familiar with the Club of Rome? The Club of Rome is a group of high-minded philosophers, teachers, industrialists, managers, politicians, statesmen, etc., who felt that they should get together periodically and take a reading on what was happening in the world. And they met first in Rome, I think because the man who was paying the bills, Aurelio Pecci, was in Rome. His colleague or co-president was a British gentleman by the name of King. And they brought together what they thought would be the best brains, thinkers, innovative thinkers, new thinkers that they could find. I think some of the people who attended that, Margaret Mead, she was still alive, Marshall McLuhan attended that, Pierre Trudeau was there, and dozens of others. I think since that time they've limited their membership to about 100. And they keep inviting people as other people leave or die until they've got a group of people who are concerned about where we're going, how we're going to get there. It's nice to think that somebody else, beside the Universal House of Justice, has that kind of concern. And we have to recognize that there are many groups in the world who are equally concerned about where things are going and how we're going to get there. And the Club of Rome has published 6 reports, or they have commissioned 6 reports to be written on the state of the world. The first one was called Limits to Growth. I think it came out in 72. I always forget the date, about 72. And it said we're really heading for catastrophe if we continue to do more of the same with regard to water, population, armaments, pollution, energy, agriculture, that things were really heading for serious problems. Most of their predictions, unfortunately, have proved to be correct. And some other factors have been added even to complicate the situation. Then they've published 6 reports, including that one. The most recent one was dealing with the question of education. No Limits to Learning, a kind of a play on the title of the first book called No Limits to Learning, because they determined, after looking at all of the data about the way in which things were going, the way in which we seem to be continuing headlong into some kind of rendezvous with disaster, that education was really the only hope. That doesn't sound too exciting either until you read the book. I think it's universally the most misunderstood book in the field of education, because most of us in North America don't like what they're saying. The book, we have to remember, was commissioned for global use, written by an international panel. And only a few of the people on that panel were what you might call Western-oriented. And so the message that they gave in this No Limits to Learning was really addressed to the entire world. And I'd like to mention just one part of that book, and then develop that in terms of its Baha'i context. In this study, they said that learning is mediated or facilitated or brought about in 5 different ways. One is through language, which is what you're getting today. Language, words. And much of our education is language-based. It's me telling you something, me providing concepts and you listening, agreeing or disagreeing. It's the most boring way, really, to educate anybody about anything. And it's what we use most consistently in all of our school systems. It's what they call maintenance learning. If you don't want anything to change, just keep giving them more and more words about the paradigm you're already in, and it will fill out their expectations. And it's useful to an extent, provided you're 100% right. If you're right, keep doing the same thing over and over again. The saying goes, if it works, don't fix it. However, it doesn't work today, and perhaps we ought to fix it. So, the notion of language as being one of the ways in which learning is mediated is something we're familiar with. We're good with words. We're good with processing words. We're good with writing and publishing and so on. We're inundated with languages and all the symbols related to language, and that would include mathematics as well as a symbol system. The second way in which learning is mediated is through tools. We're also pretty good at that. Technology. Substitute tools or technology for tools. And you look at what we've done in our society to produce all kinds of materials, machines, mechanisms, tools which make our lives better, maybe more complicated, but certainly influence us considerably in the way in which we learn about our world. Now, the next 3 things they identify, I think, is where the interest lies. They say, however, education is also mediated by values, by human relations, and by images. I'll try to refer to some notes from time to time so I won't get too far afield. The bulk of our learning today is of the maintenance variety, depending heavily on the transmission of knowledge through language which deals in concepts, abstracts, conventional wisdom, and tools, that is, skills and techniques, trades and professions. And so far, so good. Though traditional knowledge and custom are well served by language and tools, we need to add to this form of learning something which is more anticipatory, something which is forward-looking, something which is visionary, which allows us to deal with the unexpected and gives us an appetite to learn how to learn. To this, we need to utilize values. Now, what do they mean by values? By values, they mean standards, they mean ideals, they mean beliefs, they mean ethics, and they mean morality. These are all bad words in the school system today. For a while, we thought school and education should be value-free, and now we realize that that is an insane idea. There's no such thing as a value-free educational system. Values need to be reintroduced, redefined, so that young people and old people are familiar with values, with standards, what's good, what's bad, what works, what doesn't work. And the Club of Rome says this is what they have tried to find out. Human relations is the other thing that needs to be used in mediating learning. We have to know more about the relationship and the role of men and women. We have to know about human rights. We have to know about labor management. We have to know about family and marriage, conflict resolution, and consultation and negotiation. The whole realm of the way in which people relate to each other. And then finally, and this is the one that interests me most because this is where the magic is, images. In the Bible it says, where there is no vision, what? The people perish. And we could say that we are perishing these days because the vision universally is not shared. There's little hope. There's little pattern. And so people feed upon themselves. They do violence to themselves and to each other because there's nothing carrying them forward, giving them a sense of hope. So the Club of Rome says what we need in the educational system is images, vision, metaphor, worldviews, new paradigms, all of these things. Now, already they've set us on the road to thinking about some new things in education. Can we now look at values, human relations, and images? Now, when you think about that, that's precisely what Baha'u'llah has brought in his message. A new value system, a new order of human relations, as Abdu'l-Baha called it, and new imagery, a new symbol, a new way of looking at ourselves and other people. Why aren't we using it? There it is. Learning needs to deal with these new percepts, and not only with old concepts, not only with communicating tried and true ideas. It needs to open up new possibilities for the individual and society, and has to help us explore a full range of our human potential, or as the Club of Rome puts it, it has to help us bridge the human gap. Because the most underutilized resource that we have is the human spirit, the genius of the human being, which hasn't been utilized. Now, if they're on the right track, and I believe they are, we have to think of the order of change. The order of change required is revolutionary. And Shoghi Effendi told us repeatedly that we were not just tinkering with the system or fine-tuning, and those were not his words. He said that what he was calling for and what Baha'u'llah called for was a radical reorientation of men's minds. And do we take him seriously? How many of you have radically reoriented your mind recently, or in the last 10 years, or the last 5 years? But that's maybe what we do more gradually as Baha'is, but perhaps the world has to do it more dramatically. I'd like to give you just a sample from non-Baha'i sources. We know that Baha'is are radicals. We know that we're trying to strike at the root of the evil, of the error in our ways. But what are other people saying? Other more established, or you might say more accepted authorities in our society. Let's start with Einstein. He says, just as we have changed our thinking in the world of pure science, and he did it, to embrace newer and more useful concepts, so we must now change our thinking radically in the world of politics and law and human governance. It is too late to make mistakes. And when did he say that? The day after they dropped the bomb in Hiroshima. It is unthinkable, he goes on to say, that we can achieve peace without a genuine supranational organization to govern international relations. What's a physicist talking like this for? because he was also a human being with a lot of compassion. The unleashed power of the atom has changed everything. Remember this saying? This is the favorite one. Every peacenik uses this. The unleashed power of the atom has changed everything, save our modes of thinking. And thus we drift towards unparalleled catastrophe. Einstein, 1946. A long time ago, he saw what was coming. And here are some others who are also giving us a shape, an indication of the order of change. We see signs of a new awareness that mankind is becoming a single community. The new generations of the world need not only economic solutions, they need new ideas to inspire them, hopes to encourage them, steps to implement them. They need a belief in man, in human dignity, in human rights, new values. They need justice. They need freedom, peace, mutual respect, love, generosity, belief in reason rather than force. Could you guess who that is? That same report, which I'll tell you about in a minute, says that just as we have created problems as men and women, so we can solve them. It's easy. We made the problems, we can clean it up. Well, Willy Brandt said that in the Brandt Commission report on the state of the world. He's certainly not a dreamy-eyed idealist, a practical politician. Who else is talking like this? Our remedy demands a complete change of contemporary society. Who's for complete change besides the Marxists? A fundamental transformation of our system of values. Does this sound familiar? And the most profound modification of our conduct towards other men, human relations, and changes in cultural values and the world at large and the way we see the world. Here this man is talking about values, about human relations, and about images. Not a mechanical tampering with economic and political and biological conditions. Easy half measures will always fail, especially in our condition of great crisis. That was written in 1936 by Pitirim Sorokin, a sociologist, Harvard University. Here's another man. The most urgent need of our time is the need for a metaphysical reconstruction. A metaphysical reconstruction. A supreme effort to bring clarity and cohesion into our deepest convictions with regard to such questions as, what is man? Where do we come from? And what's the purpose of life? Every education system has to deal essentially with those questions. And who's this? Schumacher, the author of Small is Beautiful. Here is the indication from other than Baha'i sources about the nature of change required. Can we change? We hear that human nature is not changeable. It's interesting to look at how, at certain times in the history of the world, immediate change has occurred. For example, the revulsion which we felt towards slavery occurred almost within 3 years around the world. The women's suffrage movement, when it was finally realized what was being done to women, women's suffrage came about quickly. Child labor, when we were ready to see its evils, came into our consciousness. And the more recent movement towards human rights has pricked the conscience of all mankind, and all within relatively short periods of time. If we organized ourselves for similar attacks on the evils before us, we could bring about these change. So the order of change is great, but the chances and the opportunities for change are also very reassuring. Now, I'm going to have to cut this part out. This is the best part. But it'll put you back to the books. When I read from the Club of Rome's report under values, human relations, and images, I looked through the Baha'i writings to find out what do the Baha'i writings have to say about values, about human relations, and about the images required. And almost any book I turned to was filled with the standards and the ideals. And the one I happened to use was selections from the writings of Abdu'l-Baha. But you could choose almost any other book. If we had the time, and if this were a 3-week seminar, we'd go into all of these things. And we'd look at what the values are, about the new way in which we must look at each other and the world, about the order of human relations that we need to look at, and about the kind of images and symbols which are clear in the prayers, which are clear in the writings, which give us a whole new view of ourselves. That's the substance, that's the context in which this change has to occur. It would take too long to go into each of them, but this really, I think, is the basis of a curriculum. This is the basis of revising our views in terms of values, in terms of human relations, and in terms of images. And if we do that, if we look at the Baha'i writings, we would then be doing what the Club of Rome says. We would be providing those forces which mediate us in the direction of peace. Shoghi Effendi made it very clear when he said that our job, quoting Baha'u'llah, was to be quickeners of mankind and not fishers of men. And that's one of my favorite phrases. Quickeners of mankind. Yes. I have the reference. I'll give it to you later. It's in guidance for today and tomorrow. We should become quickeners of mankind. And the way you quicken is through images, is through the arts, is through music, is through the magic of the writings, is through the mystery of the writings. It transcends the philosophical, logical, sometimes tedious way of making a point. Plato said the same thing long before. He said that if you want to train people, his guardians as he called them, if you want to train the guardians of society, you surround them with good ideas, good environments, soft music, pastoral scenes, and they will develop an appetite for harmony and for unity and for beauty, and they will crave that in their lives, in their human relations, and so on. That's another quotation that will appear later in the longer version of this talk. But here is Shoghi Effendi saying that our job, creating the environment, and this is a challenge to a Baha'i, instead of worrying about how you're doing or where your particular struggle is that day, what can you do to contribute something to your community, and not just your Baha'i community? Because as the Universal House of Justice message makes clear, the one of the messages to the peace message, they're saying that we must focus on the barriers to peace and the prerequisites to peace. And to me, that's the most hopeful part of that whole message. Instead of going around just saying platitudinously, we must have peace and war is bad, it's much more specific. We're saying here are the things we need to look at. Racial intolerance, inequality of men and women, ignorance and so on. And that exists everywhere. Not just in Africa, not just in Asia, not just in the war-torn spots of the earth, but in your own community, in your own village, in your own city. And this is where you begin that work for peace, for harmony. Peace, you might say, is almost a byproduct of these other things which we can identify much more readily. I was asking somebody, how would you go about working for peace? And she said, first, and she wasn't a Baha'i, she says, first you need a vision, and then you work backwards. I thought that was very good, because that's exactly what Baha'u'llah has done. He's given us a vision, an eloquent, practical, mystical, beautiful vision of the world, the way it can be, man and woman seen in their true nature. And that's the environment we can do, we can have. So we see that, and then we say to ourselves, and this would be a good workshop if we had a workshop today, there's the vision. Now, what are the barriers to that? And let's remove them one by one. And what are the prerequisites for that? How can we deal with each prerequisite and make sure that it becomes instilled in our consciousness and our awareness? so that we can then begin building and reinventing this world the way it should be. Another non-Baha'i writer says that what we must do in this whole process is change our inner landscape. But he didn't know how to go about it. Baha'u'llah has helped us change that inner landscape with his writings, with his revelation, with the values, with the human relations, and with the images that he provides us with. Our inner landscape is being transformed. As we work as Baha'is, as we work with other people who are like-minded, we find that the equipment of our mind, the furniture, the inner landscape is taking on a different form. And that communicates to other people. And that, I think, is the process of education that we have to learn. Now, one last thing. Baha'is are familiar with this statement of Abdu'l-Baha's. The attainment of every object, of any object, is conditioned upon knowledge, volition, and action. And there's our mandate. The knowledge we have, the knowledge is in the writings. The prescription is there, the knowledge is there, the vision is there. It isn't enough to give a person a book and say, read it. Because then you must move into the second stage of this three-step educational process, and that's volition. And volition is where the magic occurs. The volition is where it becomes yours, where it becomes internalized, where you mingle with the metaphors, where you become familiar with the ideas, where you see the hope that's there, and you somehow catch that magic. You see Baha'u'llah for you and for the world. And that's what we have to share. Not just facts, principles, and knowledges, but also the volition, the will, because that's the seat of the motivation. The well springs of change take place through the images, the metaphors, the symbols, which are all through the Baha'i writings. And when those touch the hearts and souls of people, then they become enlisted, they can become full of hope. And they can see that the knowledge, which is then matched, and I would think transcended by the images and by the symbols, leads to the next stage, which is action. Now, the mistake I think most people make as educators, not just Baha'is, is that we start with knowledge, and then we say, let's do this. And it's easy to do that. I can go into a community and say, look, we need to have a recreation center here, don't we? It's a really important thing. Let's get organized. Let's get some money. Now, we go and have it. Really, they didn't want a recreation center. They wanted something else. It's easy to go from knowledge to action. But if that's to have any real meaning to that community, or if any learning is to have meaning to the individual, it has to begin with the knowledge, but the person has to become familiar with it. He has to become intimate with it. And then he's prepared to take that knowledge into some form of concrete action. And I think that Baha'i formula, if you want to call it such, as an educational device, is one that we should use in our Baha'i teaching, in our family teaching, and in teaching about the peace message. What is the knowledge that we need to know about peace, about war, about disarmament? How do we become familiar with that? We become familiar with that through more careful immersion in the writings. And then how do we translate that into our acts and into our deeds on a daily basis? Well, I've only been able to touch, I'll give you that quotation. I have it here that you're asking about. It's a good one to end on. The object of life to a Baha'i is to promote the oneness of mankind. The whole object of our lives is bound up with the lives of all human beings. Not a personal salvation we are seeking, but a universal one. That's a big change in thought. Not a personal salvation, forget yourself, but a universal one. Our aim is to produce a world civilization which will in turn react on the character of the individual and through it reach out to the conglomerate life of men. And for some people it's reassuring to know that Plato said that thousands of years ago. And Shoghi Effendi had put that into operation through the administrative order, and which is now being carried out through the instructions and guidance of the World Center.